Hello and welcome back to the Piskie Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. Hope you've all had a good couple of weeks. As always, a big thank you to everyone that's been listening to this series for all your support, and to all the fantastic patrons over on Patreon as well. If I dare to say it, it's starting to feel more and more spring-like here in Cornwall. We've had some lovely sunny days. Though I have to admit, I've yet to take my first proper swim in the sea this year. But I think I'm just going to have to be brave and take the plunge at some point in the next couple of weeks now that it's starting to warm up. Just a quick reminder that tickets are now on sale for the podcast live talks this spring. The talk exploring Cornish Piskies will be at the Polly in Falmouth on the 23rd of April. Into Bodmin at the Old Library on Friday the 25th of April, and then St Austell Arts Centre on Saturday the 26th. If you're a fan of ghostly stories, then you can join the Cornish Bird and myself as we team up to explore spooky tales from the Cornish coastline at Port Eliot on the 4th of May, into Bodmin on the 17th of May, and the Polly on the 24th of May. And you can find links to all these events in the show notes. I think that's it as far as news goes, so let's crack straight on with it. The topic for this episode is one that I've wanted to explore for a while. Since the project first started, really. And it's a place that's so iconic that if you were to literally type in Cornwall in a web search, it's one of the first images that will crop up. And for me, it's a place that's always been special and formed some of my earliest memories as a kid. I grew up in Parr in mid-Cornwall, but my family are all from Penzance. So I can remember countless visits down west. Heading down the A30, you'd come through Crowless and you get to a certain point up on the hill, and you'd suddenly see it there out in the bay, like a scene in some kind of fairy tale. I'm talking, of course, about St Michael's Mount. For those of you perhaps not familiar with it, St Michael's Mount is a tidal island in Mounts Bay, opposite Marazion in West Cornwall, which has at the top of it a medieval castle and church. It's amazing, really, and it genuinely looks like something from a fantasy. In fact, it's been used as a filming location for projects like House of the Dragon. A place like this lends itself to myths and legends, most famously the giant of St Michael's Mount, as well as other tales. I wanted to delve a bit deeper and find out more about the history of this place, who lived there, some of the other stories that are perhaps less well known. And for me, this was also very much a personal journey too, because I actually have a family connection to the Mount. Some weeks back, I got in touch with St Michael's Mount to see if they'd be interested in having a chat as part of the podcast. And quite quickly, they got back to me and introduced me to Anna Berska, who's one of the senior guides on the Mount. So in this episode, you're going to be hearing from my conversation with Anna as we discuss some of the history, the stories, and why this place is so fascinating. So, without any further prattling, here's our next episode, St Michael's Mount. St Michael's Mount looketh so aloft, as it brooketh no concurrent for the highest place. Ptolemy termeth it Ocranum. The Cornish men, Cariclos in Cos, that is, the hoary rock in the wood. The same is sundered from the mainland by a sandy plain, of a slight shoot in breadth, passable at the ebb on foot, with boat on the flood. Your arrival on the farther side is entertained by an open green of some largeness, which finishing where the hill beginneth, leads you to the conduction of a winding and craggy path, and that at the top delivereth you into a little plain, occupied for the greatest part by a fort of the old making. A quote there from Richard Carew's The Survey of Cornwall, published back in 1602. Thank you to Owen Holland from the Cornish Language podcast for his advice on the pronunciation there. You get a sense, even back then, of just how much this place makes a real impression on people, which is hardly surprising when you have an island with this majestic castle that seems to rise up out of the sea. I can remember when I first visited, I was probably about 6 or 7 years old, walking along the causeway from Marazion when the tide was out, heading over to the mount, arriving there and encountering a little village on the island, and from there heading up what seemed at the time like an endless number of steps to reach the castle and the church at the top. Along the way there was a stone, and I can remember being told that this stone had once been the heart of the giant cormorant. And of course, for me, as a child obsessed with myths and legends, that was amazing. Ever since, the mount has held a kind of fascination for me. And I think it does for a lot of people too. The stories around the giant who was said to live there are still very popular. And it's something that we explored in episode 17, where I discussed Cornish giants with Mike O'Connor. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I recommend checking that one out if you're interested in the giant side of things. In this episode, I wanted to delve a bit more into the history and some of the other stories from the mount. Partly because I discovered a few years back that some of my own ancestors, called the Matthews and the Jagos, from at least the 18th century up until relatively recently, the 1900s, had lived in the village on the mount. So there was very much a personal interest in wanting to find out what life might have been like on the island as well. Some weeks back I got in touch with Anna, who's a senior tour guide on St Michael's Mount, and I was invited over to have a chat. So one very windy, rainy morning a few weeks ago, I set off for Marazion and met Anna on the quay, and because the tide was in at the time, we hopped into the amphibious vehicle along with members of the team from the mount and headed across. At this point, I briefly reverted to being about 8 years old, just because it's really exciting going through the sea on a stormy morning with the waves crashing over the roof above you. And then, after a few minutes, we arrived on the mount and headed over to the cafe to have a chat. We began by talking about the early history of the mount, links with saints such as St Michael, St Caddoc and St Keen, and medieval miracles.
St Caddoc and St Keen, have you looked at them?
No, I haven't, no.
St Caddoc and St Keen, early 5th century kind of Welsh-based saints, massive family, like 24 kids, and most of them became saints. And they came over here in about 490. And St Keen is quite often associated with Holy Wells. Keen's a girl, Cadoc's a boy. I think they were cousins, or there might be niece and nephew. But she came over to the mount about 490, and there's 5, it's 4 that we know of, probably 5 freshwater wells here. So it was one of those first notions of something otherworldly or not human happening. So she came and granted fresh water to the island. So, yeah, I mean, they accidentally stumbled across what they think is the 5th freshwater well a couple of years ago. But it's St Michael's Mount because St Michael appeared in 495. And that's I suppose, the origins of so much of the storytelling. And he appeared because there were mermaids just lolling around on the rocks out there. I mean, they weren't lolling. They were obviously luring fishermen to their inevitable fate with their siren songs. But Hocus Rocks, to the west of the island, they were there, and there was this big storm, and St Michael appears to ward them off the storm, and to protect them. He's the patron saint of paramedics and police and protectors. He's a protector of people who protect. He's the big cheese of that kind of stuff. So he appears to ward them off. And some people say it was like a big white light. And I mean that happens a lot in stories. You know, a light appears. And when we were talking earlier about geology and how geology can be important to different areas, there's a lot of sort of emphasis on granite and tin here. And also the Egyptians, I mean, we were talking to Kerry about Egypt or whatever, but that they can be conductors of electricity. So if you think it's a stormy night, you've got moonlight, you've got granite, you've got quartz, you've got tin, why wouldn't you have a white light appear? Maybe. So was it a natural phenomenon that has been sort of made into a story of St Michael, or was it St Michael? I mean, he was really busy during the 5th century. All over Europe, there's the St Michael line from, you know, Southern Ireland, here, Mont Saint Michel, Gargano, Delphi, Mount Carmel, that whole 5th century is up and down Europe, like slaying dragons left, right and centre, and serpents and stuff. So it could have been him, but it could have been a geological phenomenon as well, this white light. So I suppose that's where a lot of the first origins, St Cadec, St Keen and then St Michael in that 5th century, those are the ones that we know are recorded, or that we've had recorded. And that's where it all sort of starts: mermaids, saints, water, holy water. But I mean, the island there have been people here for thousands of years. You know, we've had archaeological digs in the last 2 years that put people here thousands of years BC. You know, there are roundhouses on both sides of the island. But we also know that, you know, at least 2000 BC, this is a wooded area. And so when they found seashells that can be dated, this is surrounded by water now, but 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, it wasn't. So people have walked to water to come back to St Michael's Mount, or Carrickluce as it was, called then the grey rock in the woods, and eaten it. So there's this importance, like a spiritual importance to people coming here. And I'm not going to say perform rituals because there's no evidence of that, but just the food that was consumed. There's been effort put into being here. So it's had this draw for a long, long time. You know, whether it's ley lines, whether it's saints. The mount is very special for bringing people. Today we call it tourism, but it's not always tourism. Some people are like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know. I just felt like I had to come here today, and it's like, that's really cool. Wonder why that is. Is there something that has drawn you here? And it could be your iPhone, but it could be something deeper within you that's sort of brought you here as well. So I think that's quite evident even today, you know, that people still come for reasons that they can't explain. If you jump to the 13th century, 1263, 1264, you've got people coming down who, there were 4 miracles performed in those 2 years. People regained their sight. They regain their ability to walk and talk because of miracles that have been performed. Yeah, it's quite a powerful, pokey place for people from all sort of, I don't know, bents and looks and experiences, really.
Anna mentioned there a couple of examples of the miracles that were said to have taken place during the medieval period. And I managed to find out a little bit more in an article published by the Reverend G.H. Doble of Wendron called Miracles at St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall in 1262. In there is a translation of a medieval text, originally in Latin, that had been put together by an abbot named Robert of Torigny, which is in Normandy, and the translation reads, "Let no one going to the monastery of St. Michael in Cornwall doubt that a certain woman named Christina, of the neighbourhood of Glastonbury, who had been deprived of the sight of her eyes for about 6 years, coming with the greatest devotion to the said monastery for the sake of prayer and pilgrimage, on the 14th of May, 1262, before High Mass on a certain Sunday, in the sight of the people, persevering in the greatest faith, by the intercession of the blessed Archangel Michael, recovered miraculously the sight of her closed eyes. There were present as witnesses many monks and others. In the same year, on the 11th of June, a certain woman named Matilda, of the parish of Lannisley, which is Golville, who for 2 days and 2 nights had lost consciousness and the power of speech, being brought by her parents to that monastery on Sunday. Immediately she had entered the church, by the prayers of the captain of the heavenly chivalry, was restored to consciousness and the power of speech. I saw it and was present." He goes on to write of another girl named Alice from Hereford, who'd also been without sight for 7 years. She went to the Mount on pilgrimage on the 29th of January and miraculously recovered her sight as well. Do people come here having much knowledge of the place originally? Do they...
No, not often.
Okay.
No. They just, sometimes they're like, oh, I've heard, it's like, is there a link to Mont Saint-Michel? I've heard of Mont Saint-Michel. So yeah, but no, there's often not.
Okay.
It's an anomaly or something spectacular, but they don't know any of the history. They know it's a place that's pretty epic to look at, and it's tidal, and that's mad. Because some people have never even seen the sea. You know, they live landlocked, so they don't understand tides. It's like a whole, woo! And the tide goes in, and there's a causeway, and a castle. I mean, it is epic. It is epic. I mean, there aren't many places like that.
No.
There's just not. So, geographically, it's quite special. So, their understanding of the history doesn't necessarily play a part in the woo factor, but it's got a big woo factor, you know. Just, I mean, it was a fun ride over, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. It was really good fun, especially on a day like this where you can't tell if you're listening, obviously, but it's blowing a hoolie, I suppose, isn't it? Or it was.
Yeah.
It's the right way. But it just makes it more atmospheric.
It does, doesn't it? It's beautiful in the sun. You know, it's the jewel. It sparkles. It's green and granite and sparkling in an azure sea. And then today, it's gnarly out there, and the waves coming over the top of the boat. And yeah, it's fabulous. But
this is what I expect, though, from Cornish weather.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to prepare for it. Are you in shorts?
No, that's
Dear
the only thing.
listeners, he's not in shorts.
Yeah, I'm fully committed yet.
I think all our boatmen, well, not all of them, a lot of the boatmen they're like postmen, wear shorts all year round.
Yeah.
So, yes, it doesn't matter what the weather's doing. But it is, even on a day like today where it's grey and you can barely see points of land as reference, it's still very atmospheric.
And I think the first thing I remember about the mount when I was a kid was probably being told by my gran stories about, you know, the giant of St Michael's Mount and things like that.
Yeah.
For especially a lot of young people, does that tend to be their sort of introduction to the mount? Is that how they kind of identify with it?
Yeah, there's quite the giant is a great story. You know, Cornwall has had, or maybe still has, a proliferation of giants. So Cormoran is quite a well-known story, and you know, he was killed by Jack, and lots of people know Jack and the Beanstalk. It's the same Jack. That Jack, he was Cornish, Marizoan boy through and through. So yeah, a lot of kids they're told that story, and it's very often actually by their parents who have come when they've been children, and it is that storytelling of the giant's heart still beating. I mean, it's a great story, and it's true, you know. So it is true as you walk up to the castle, and you put your left foot on the stone on the heart, and you put your right hand across your chest, you can feel a heartbeat. I mean, basic anatomy says it's your own, but that's not the point. You can feel a heartbeat, so it's quite it's a great way to get stories into kids. And then, I mean, the person who told that story was a kid, and they had either experienced it or they'd been told it. So there is this generational drip, 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 and it's great. Yeah, kids love it.
I think it's magical, really, because I remember that experience when I was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and that was an amazing thing, because it's clear now that obviously, like, my parents had been told these things, they're passing that on, and I love that idea that people are still coming and doing that, and that you know, those young people, their experiences are through storytelling, and then they get to experience this place, and it just makes it even more amazing. And
it's alive as well. It keeps it alive. I mean, that's what stories are, isn't it? They're keeping things alive, whether that's I don't know how to find something, but it's a very tangible thing as well. When you're here, you can physically touch that heart, and it's so nice when you meet families, and there are 3 generations of them, and then, you know, you've got the kids that are all, wow, what did ice cream? And then you've got Grandad who will say, I came here when I was 7. Yeah. And I was told a story about a giant. Is the heart still here? And you're like, the heart is still here. And then Grandad reverts to being 7 and excited. And it's I mean, that's today that's this year. But that was happening last year. That was happening 5 years ago, 50 years ago. So, yeah, that through the generations, the storytelling continues. It's wonderful, and we still tell it today. And we encourage, you know, our education officer. She tells the story, and she's telling hundreds of children, and they're gonna eventually tell their children, and they'll tell their children. And it's really nice that there's this. It's almost going forwards in time as well as backwards in time. We're moving through time with stories. It's great. Yeah, it's a good thing.
Are there other stories that people aren't as aware of? Are there more kind of like local stories that you kind of either hear from having worked here and having been here that you pick up over time that are kind of less well known or don't get talked about as much?
I mean, I shouldn't say this, but I suppose, yes, the guides, they're like, have you heard a story? And a few years ago there was someone who sort of works in our communications office, and it was either early morning or late evening. I want to say it was early morning, and he's walking on the causeway, and it's just clearing, you know, just he might still get a little bit wet feet. And a lot of stories are about, you know, like a headless horseman like running across land, and ghosts and woo, and he describes walking across the causeway, and as you walk across the causeway, you've got to your left sort of buildings and green lawns, and to the right the harbour, and you've got a lot of granite buildings in front of you that you're being funneled towards. And he said what he saw was an absolute absence of light, like a black hole in light and space, and quite big. I mean, not house size, but kind of rider on a horse size. But an absence of anythingness, moving, just for a couple of seconds. I asked him if he'd had a cataract operation or anything recently, and he hasn't. So, but that, some people will say that the first generation of the St Albans family, he was lost on the causeway. That he was riding his horse on a storm, and the tide was coming in, and he was swept off his horse and killed and drowned.
With more people starting to come into the cafe, we then headed over to the education centre to continue our chat there. And I wanted to know more about this story of a phantom figure on the causeway. So this is the chap on the horseback.
Yes, the lack of light and darkness. So it was quite close to the island. I like that story personally. I like that story.
What were his thoughts on it? Was he quite sceptical about it, or was he quite... Did that change his perspective on it, if you like?
I think he was quite taken aback that he should have seen it.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't expecting, a lot of people wander around going, is there tell me a ghost story. And then they want to see ghosts. And it's like, I'm sorry, they're not here until 2. Come back and we'll get them all set up for you. So it was quite a... He said he felt like a little bit winded, like, shock. And then sort of discombobulated, that kind of out-of-body, wasn't expecting that. And I think it did change his perspective a bit, I think, because he was so surprised, but not scared. When you retell some of these stories, none of them are scary. There's never... When Dylan was describing the footsteps walking towards him in the Chevy Chase room, he said it felt weird, but not scary, just weird. There's I think one of the things even today, people are so in awe of the place. There's a beautiful feeling about it, and whether that's spiritual, emotional, just blown away by the sheer magic of the place. It's such a positive place to be, such a nice feeling about it. It's a pleasure for everybody, being staff or visiting. It's just got a really nice feeling about it.
Does it feel like being part of a community?
It is a community, but we enjoy, when we spoke earlier about grandparents with their grandchildren here, and that gives us so much pleasure, and it's giving them so much pleasure that they can return to those childhood memories and stories, and they're, octogenarians at this point. And for us to hear those stories, because we tell stories, we tell the stories and we tell the histories, but then other people will share their experiences, and those experiences are more real than the stories almost sometimes, because they're very immediate or in recent memory, so they just add to it as well. And even if people aren't telling those stories, I feel they by being here, they're giving a bit of that story, just purely by physically being here. They're sort of emanating a story, even if it's not vocalised, and they're always good. No one's told me a bad story, it was a terrible. There's never been a terrible story. Even those that come back, I broke my leg here in 1985, and the staff were wonderful. You're like, thanks. So it is a stunning place.
As I said, I like it when it's like this, because I think it makes it so atmospheric.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. When we do tours of the village, we tell stories of the storms, because then, it's a dark and stormy night is more exciting than it was a blistering hot day, because there is so much atmosphere wrapped up in that as well. I mean, when St Michael appeared in 495 to warn the sailors about the mermaids on the rocks. That wasn't a clear night with flat seas. That was a dark and stormy night. So there is so much atmosphere with that as well. So a day like today, when it's overcast and you're hunkered down, there's a lot more atmosphere. And the architecture itself, it's built to withstand that. Big solid walls, small little windows, to not graping vistas that you see today of steel and glass. It's all little windows and to protect from the elements. Yeah, it's quite cool.
Coming back to that sort of, because I'm sort of fascinated by this sort of figure on the causeway. You've mentioned, is there theories behind the identity of this figure, if you like, is one of the St Albans? You said it might be, the thinking is it might be the first St Alban who was here. Is that, I'm trying to remember back to my notes, is it Captain John St Alban?
Yeah, Colonel John.
Colonel.
They were captains of the Mount quite often, but I think his title was Colonel, because of his military service during the Civil War.
Right.
So, I mean, if you take the stories of, it's pre-planes, trains and automobiles. It is horses and boats. So who would be on a horse on the causeway, and why a horse on the causeway? And if he did die on his horse on the causeway, as we believe he did, then it makes sense that it's him. Yeah.
Did he come into possession of the Mount because of because of what he'd done during the Civil War, essentially, as a parliamentarian?
Yeah, he was stationed here for sort of from 1647 he first came, and it was in 1659 he was offered to buy it. So 12 years of him being here, he was then offered to buy it, and it came with 5,000 acres of land, and he'd, we talk about a figure between £1,000 and £2,000, somewhere in there, which equates to sort of millions today. But he was a colonel, he was a paid soldier, and very well respected. So that's how he got to being here. He was military, he was stationed here, and then when it came the opportunity to buy it, he took that. But the family themselves, they've been in Cornwall a lot longer. There are links to Clowance estate, so this was part of their estate. Clowance was a real hub as well, because it's on the mainland. It's a lot easier. You don't have the weather conditions and things, tides to deal with. So this was just part of their estate. It's not until the 19th century that this becomes their primary residence. Yeah, many generations later. Yeah.
Colonel, the sort of the next thread I'm thinking about is to do with the causeway and Chapel Rock itself. Am I right in thinking that was the chapel that was there? Was that dedicated to the Virgin Mary?
I think it was Catherine.
Okay.
I mean, today, it always has been quite an effort to actually get up to the church. So, yes, there was almost like a pit stop there. You could go to the chapel on the rock, yeah. Marazion has been a market town for centuries, but you'd get your supplies there while you were waiting, or you could rest up, but you could also go, to the Chapel Rock. And it was a really large, big storm, just sort of wiped it off the map. But as you walk down the causeway, either direction, but for example, if you're leaving the island and you're walking the causeway, there's a really big stone, very square stone, on the right-hand side, obviously cut by hand, with a socket hole in it, and there was a cross in that, like a marker. There are two in the castle. Well, one in the castle and one on the path up to the castle. They're called lantern crosses, so they're pilgrimage markers, and there would have been one in that socket. And I think it was in the 18th century. It just became a shipping hazard, really, because when the tide comes in, you've got this great big cross sticking out. So when it finally disappeared, it disappeared, as did the chapel on the rock as well. But yeah, that is why it's called Chapel Rock, because there was a chapel there. Yeah. It is quite a hard mission to walk up there, especially on a day like today. It's quite slippery and stuff. So
yeah, again, it makes it so atmospheric because you have got these. You're looking at this rock, and you can see these steps to basically nowhere.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah. And there's a big swathe of trees in between you and the castle, and you've got to negotiate them. And then there's a pet cemetery that you walk past, and then there's the well where the bones of Cornwall are. So yeah, it's quite an exciting walk up. There's lots of breathers on the way, thankfully, because people often ask, you must be so fit walking up and down there every day, but we are the land of pasties, so no, it doesn't marry. No, yeah.
There's a couple of things that I've heard that'd be interesting to chat about that have almost become sort of fallen into sort of modern folklore. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts are. And they're kind of caught up with two accounts of skeletons that have been discovered. One that's up at the church.
Yeah.
That I found part of. I think it was from the Old Cornwall Society.
Yeah.
It was from about 1900, and it was talking about how there'd been this discovery of a skeleton in the 1720s or something like that.
Right.
But since you come across articles in, I won't mention the publication, but that talk about, like 8-foot skeleton discovered and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued about that as to whether there's much truth behind that, or whether that in itself has become sort of modern myth.
It's true.
Is it?
Yeah, it's very true. When the guides start in about April time talking to the public, the skeleton is about 7'2". By about October, he's 7'8", 8 foot. He grows, but the records show that he was about 7'6". And when you're in the church, there's an area, if you're looking at the altar, quite close to the altar on the right-hand side, that is it's a cell. Be behind the pews. You can see it, and you can't access it, but you can see the doorway. And if you look through certain records, in the 15th century, he's not recorded as being there. There are records at St Hilary's Church. He's not there. This cell is used for storing the silk and the jewels and the important religious items. And it's not until I think the 17th century that this skeleton appears, as it were. But it is recorded time and time again. And I think it was in the early 19th century that he was taken down to the graveyard and interred in an unmarked grave. But who he was, that is complete conjecture. He was allegedly found with a leather jug, and that's the only thing that was in his cell. And the leather jug is on display, and it's called a blackjack jug. It's quite large. It's about two, nearly 3 foot tall, made of leather and wood, and they were sort of synonymous with the Civil War period. Cromwell's horse was called Blackjack, and when he died, his hide was made into a limited number of these jugs. And there are many, many replicas, but they're all called blackjack jugs. This isn't an original blackjack, but it is one of those jugs. So to date it we're not sure. If you look at stories of anchorites, and that's where I veer to, that they're holy people who are ostracised from society for some reason. And whether it's a physical difference, and people would talk to these anchorites for solace, for knowledge, for understanding, and the anchorite themselves have given themselves over to the church for food, for protection. If they don't fit into society, they've literally given their lives, their bodies, their soul to the church, and then will live and die their days associated with that church. I mean, Julian of Norwich is the most famous, And that's where I sit on it, that it was a different, the scale of the skeleton. This is someone who is extraordinary, physically within society at that time being so big. So that ostracisation from society to go to the church, to hear the masses, and to be safe, and have solace and give solace, and then dies there. But some people will tell a story that it's an arundel. So there was a fight on the beach, and he apparently was a very large gentleman, big strong soldier. He died on the beach, blood spilled everywhere, and it's his bones that are in there. So there are different versions, and it depends. You can talk to me, and I'll say it's an anchorite or someone holy of some kind, someone different from society. But then you'll have people who have looked and gone, he's an arundel. It goes with the story. So the bones are true. The location of the bones, that's true. Who, when, where, why, that's conjecture.
It makes it all the more fascinating though, because people then present theories, and obviously if you were to Google it, you then get people going, well, this is the origin of the giant St Michael's Mount kind of idea. So people have linked it with that as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the giant that lived here, Cornwall, I mean, the giants, the proper giants, they were 18 foot tall and 8 foot wide. So, I mean, that's a giant. So you can make that link, but our giant must have been a baby giant then, because he's not giant. But you can definitely, they can overlap and they can get confused. But we've had, I suppose, more than one giant here then, really. But he's an elusive character.
Hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. Perhaps leave a review. All of that really helps this project to keep growing. And if you'd like to support the series further, perhaps consider becoming a Patreon patron. This podcast is completely independent and self-funded. So from as little as £1 a month, pledges on Patreon help me to cover the running costs and the research fees, as well as to get hold of source materials for each episode. So if you can help there, that'd be amazing. If not, no worries. Just continuing to spread the word among friends and on social media is also a real help. Right, let's get back to the episode. There's another one I wanted to ask you about, but I was reading that there was a skeleton discovered, I think, beneath the shop, or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that true? Because again, I've heard that there was maybe carbon dating done on that as well.
Yes, there was. I tell a story that he was found with part of his skull missing, the lower half of his right leg missing, and the skeleton of a parrot by his right shoulder.
Right.
2/3 of that story are true. There was one bit in there that I made up. But he was, yes. I think he was being dated to 15th century. And cemeteries themselves, I wouldn't say they're not a modern phenomenon, but we have sacred grounds and sacred areas that people could quite often be interred facing, different sun directions or moon directions. So he was found under the shop floor when they were putting new flooring down, and there is a reluctance to put a shovel in the ground on here, because you will find a skeleton a lot of the time, because today you can see the cemetery, it's an enclosed area, but Lord knows what you're going to find elsewhere. There's an area, if you're standing outside the church and you just stand on the terrace and you look down, There's a small green area there, a very flat, one of probably the only flat areas there is. And as you come out of the church, there's a headstone on the floor there, and it's just the bottom half of someone who is probably an abbot or something, and allegedly it was found in this grassy area. And if you think of the pyramid of religion, you know, with God at the very top, and all of us sort of underneath, that grassy area is probably a burial ground as well. That the abbots, that's the closest you could get to the church, so you'd be interred there. And there are some stories that people were buried vertically in the flooring of the church by the altar. And there's a little plaque on the floor that says bones were found here. So there are a lot of people interred in different places, and none of them really marked. The 7'6" skeleton stands out because it's a great story, but actually, are there abbots on that grassy area? And some people will say that there were 6 vertical bodies found. That's a very old story, and I don't tend to retell it because I can't find any information about it. But there's a little plaque there, and sometimes stories, as we were saying earlier, can get lost in generations. There can be a gap of 3 generations, and I would be making something up, I feel. I don't think I've necessarily got the right to make that story up. But it's kind of interesting, because 6 vertical skeletons? Really? That's a good one.
It's unusual.
Yes, of course. Vertical?
Yeah.
But is that just because we're granite and there wasn't a lot of space?
Yeah, it says to me almost that there's not space to kind of lay people out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why they were then later buried in the grassy area. Because a lot of monastic gardens have a grassy area. If you look at sort of medieval gardens near churches, they were places of contemplation and peace, and they're very close to the church, you know, the pinnacle. And so it makes sense that they're buried there. But again, no one dared put a spade in the ground in case, because you don't know what you're going to find. Yeah. So there are quite a lot of skeletons.
It doesn't surprise me because of the history here, but one thing that I find fascinating about this place is it seems like over the course of the past 1,000 years or so, it's kind of gone between being a sort of monastic site and then being fortified. I guess just as the sign of different times over the years. I find that quite fascinating because that must lead to lots of stories and such a varied history, because it's gone from a place of religion to a place that then is kind of obviously being fortified because of times of war.
Yeah. I mean, it was the original footprint of the church is 1135, and it was only a few decades later, 1193, Henry de la Pommeraye sort of invaded, and that's when they put soldiers here as well, 1 or 2. But it very early in its building of the granite building at the summit is it becomes fortified. Yeah, I think some of that goes back to the bay is a very nice, beautiful shaped bay, but either end of it you've got Land's End and the Lizard, which are just shipwreck central, and this, historically, even to recent history, is a safe place to be. So it was quite a catch for people. You'd think in a military history, it's part of the shoring up of the south coast that Henry VIII does with Pendennis Castle further along and things like that. But because of the shape of it, it's quite hard to take, but then it's also quite hard to sustain. Because how are you going to feed people? Bless St Caddoc and St Keen especially, there's the water here, but what are you going to do for supplies? To get food on and off, and people. So it's never been held as a fort for a long time. And I think, we look at religion today, I think it is, it is spreading wider, but they were doctors, philosophers, they looked at the stars, they looked at science. It wasn't, maybe it was done under the umbrella of religion, but they were the people pushing the boundaries of experimentation and stuff. So when they were sort of pensioned off onto the mainland, they took those skills with them as well. So they had those abilities to read and write and teach, and it wasn't just about God, it's about community. And I'm not necessarily a religious person, more a spiritually based person, but not one religion. But I like that idea that the monks and the soldiers lived harmoniously together. Again, that's just my angle, though, maybe. But it is as buildings go, that very small secular church, eating, sleeping, storage didn't last long before it was then bolted onto to have soldiers be able to protect it as well. But if that's 1193, Henry de la Pommeraye, it's 1263, 1264, that you have miracles happening. So it's still, they're balancing and rubbing along together, the soldiers and the monks, living in harmony. Anyway, yeah.
That's such an interesting balance to strike, isn't it? The fact that you've got this fortified place, but at the same time, it's a site of pilgrimage.
Yeah.
I find that really fascinating.
Absolutely, yeah. That people are still coming and the soldiers aren't. They're not opposed to it. They're just, I suppose it's like going through security at the airport, really. Just come on through. Okay, you look a bit dodgy. We're going to pat you down. And maybe it was the same for the pilgrims. You look a bit. Are you sure you're a pilgrim? Okay, we'll just check you out. So, yeah, maybe that was the 12th century.
Just leave your mace at the causeway.
Yeah, would you mind? Just put that down there.
Have you got a particular kind of favourite story or something that you kind of have picked up just from working here that's sort of one of your favourite areas or parts of the sort of history on that?
I love the wishing stone, because I think wishing transcends anything. That's almost like a prayer. It can be all sorts of things, but to have a wishing stone can that's accessible to anyone. And when a lady came to rub it and then came back 4 years later to say thank you because she wished for grandchildren, and then she came back and she had grandchildren. She's like, it's because I rubbed the stone. So that accessibility to everyone, to have their wishes and their dreams, and to be able to tie it to here, I think is really lovely. And it's as you walk into the church, it's the highest piece of bedrock on the island, and it's just the size of your baby finger, and it's a gnarly black, kind of shiny where it's been rubbed so much stone. It's nothing. It doesn't glitter. It doesn't look like the top of a wand, or it should be in a tiara. It's just a gnarly bit of stone. And as you walk into the church, it's on your left. So as I walk in and out of the church, I always give it a rub. I'm not necessarily wishing for something, but it's almost like a protective element or something. Just makes you feel good, I think. So, and the joy of people proposing, because their stories will tell you that in the Victorian era, I think it peaked, but prior to that the St Michael chariot is on the top of the bell tower, that there was this race to get up there between a newly married husband and wife, and whoever got there first would wear the pants in the family for the rest of that relationship. There's a lot of elbows to get up there, and I think those kind of stories are great. And when people propose today, and she flashes her left hand and you go, we just got it, he's just done it. And it's such a joyous thing, and then you can tell them those stories, and if because you can't get to the bell tower anymore, it's quite dangerous. To make those wishes, or if you speak to the person who's proposing, give that stone a little rub first. Those kind of things, I think, they've transcended time. That granite has been there 300 million years. That specific bit of granite has probably been there 300 million years. So, yeah, that you can still rub it. It's wonderful. That's the story that I think I like the most, because it's so tangible. Yeah.
There was something I was going to ask, and I think that would maybe be, maybe if I join on the tour in a bit, that would be kind of enlightening on that as well. But I'm intrigued as to sort of, I guess, the history, a little bit of the history about the community that would have been living here, I suppose, and what life would have been like. Like, what were people doing here? Was it quite a mixture of people? Were people living here because they were working on the estate here and maintaining the estate? Or was it also that there was this sort of independent community and they're just doing what people do, like they are fishing, they're doing other bits and things like that?
It's more the latter. Until modern, I say modern, the last 200 or even less actually years, it was just another little town where you could fish from, earn a trade from. It didn't come under the sort of the estate until a lot later into modern times, as it were. It was fishing, and a lot of the people here were associated with that. So you've got pot makers, net lofts, and net makers. So it was a very watery existence, ship makers, boat repairs. If you look at some of the family trees and things, you can look at what their, in the modern census, what their jobs were. But it's not until sort of, I think, even up into the 20th century that it came under the estate, per se, and working for the estate. Well, late 19th century, 20th century. Because the family had, they were mostly based on the mainland till then. This was just a self-sustaining community. And people would come and people would go. They didn't have to sort of seek permission to do things, although there was a nod to the family. But a lot of trade, as we mentioned earlier, it's come up from Europe. It can't get to the Lizard, it can't get to Land's End, it lands here first. So you have, in the 18th century, a lot of oars going up to Wales. Boats go up, boats come down. But it's also coming from Europe as well. But the tour is a really good way to get a feel for the people. But having 3 pubs here kind of speaks volumes about how people lived and how people enjoyed themselves. There isn't enough land for it to be farmed or anything, although there were a herd of cows here until the beginning of the 20th century, literally the first decade of the 20th century, for dairy, for cheese. There's a derelict ice house up towards the castle that's not accessible. It's derelict, but the family being here have put in and created gardens, and they are the owners. But the village itself was self-sustaining, but it was a fishing community, not a farming community, but a trade. There was a 2p tax on every elephant foot umbrella stand that landed in the harbour. I mean, that's shocking today, but that's part of the trade. The Victorians loved that kind of stuff. Elephant foot umbrella stand, yes, count me in. So the island itself is always been about the trade, and whether that's fishing or trade from further afield across Europe. It's and you can still say that now, really. Our visitors are from all over the world, and there's a very, very small community of just over sort of 30 people. I think 10 of them are children. And if you look at the heyday when there's over 200 people living here, some of them are children as well. And they're being brought up here, and there was a school here for education. So it's not quite as rough and wild as you might imagine. There is a little bit of decorum here, even with those 3 pubs. The last one was closed in 1902 because, well, that's another story, really.
And that's peak temperance time as well, and things like that as well going on, I suppose.
Yes, but fishermen's allegedly walking up the steps and giving Edward VII a mouthful as they staggered out of the pub, came head to head with the king. And that was when the Lord St. Leonard said, right, no more pub. If you can't behave, you can't have a pub, which is fair. I get where it's coming from. I mean, that's the story we tell. The truth is slightly different, but don't let that get in the way of a good story.
Do you think that because of the nature of it, of the way it's situated, it being a fishing community, do you think that meant, especially this being Cornwall and the history we had, particularly back in the 18th century, smuggling was a factor here as well, potentially?
Oh, that's a good one. It's quite an obvious place, though, isn't it? As you go further towards Land's End, and you've got like the Wink and places like that, those are more likely places. I don't hold any weight with the Cornish being wreckers at all.
No.
I believe they took advantage of wrecks.
Yeah, salvaging is one thing.
Absolutely. They weren't wreckers. Why you wouldn't do that? You just wouldn't do that. And so there are stories, of sort of Par Salmon's wrecks and gold being taken by the big families. Some people will say the St Albans and the Arundels, and people were involved with that. And that's how they accumulated a lot of their wealth. But the mount itself, there are a few tunnels, but they're not very deep, and they were more for prospective mining, and they didn't go very far. But there isn't like a rat's nest of caves and tunnels, unfortunately. I wish there were. But there was a Bronze Age hoard found here. There have been people using this place as a safe sanctuary. But smugglers, I'm not so sure about this.
Something that's just kind of cropped up again, that's sort of sprung up from somewhere in my research that's popped into my brain, is I remember reading that about, I think this is during the time of sort of the Wars of the Roses, that there was there a siege here? Was it something to do with the Earl of Oxford? And I read something about a skirmish on the beach, and there was someone quite prominent who was killed in the skirmish on the beach.
That's the Arundels.
Is that the Arundel, and the skeleton is sometimes linked to that Arundel?
Yes, yeah. And by man's hand I shall die on golden sand, I think the line is. Because he went over to Trerice, he wanted to move away from the sea, because he was so worried that he was going to be struck down on the beach and killed. He was like, okay, I'm going to go inland. I'm not going to... There you go. I've just cancelled that theory out because I am nowhere near it. But then he was called into action for this skirmish to take them out, and that's how he did end his days. So it came round and got him in the end, yeah. But he was the gentleman that was the big guy, yeah. I think there was... They didn't think it would last that long, but they ended up pulling in about 3,000 troops. It was quite a big deal, yeah, to take it back. But it was only held for, I think, 5 months at that period. So, yeah.
So I looked into this, and in Robert Hunt's work, we're told the story of Sir John Arundel, who was Sheriff of Cornwall during the reign of Edward IV, back in the 1400s. Sir John had been a magistrate, and legend says he offended a wild shepherd who was thought by the people to be possessed of supernatural powers. Sir John had had this shepherd imprisoned, and later the shepherd angrily muttered, "When upon the yellow sand thou shalt die by human hand." Superstitious about this prophecy, we're told that Sir John moved further away from the sea, but some time later he eventually received a mortal wound during a skirmish on the sands at Marazion. Some sources say that he was later interred in the chapel on St Michael's Mount. I often imagine that you get these sort of 18th and 19th century, often they're sort of kind of antiquarians, and they're often vicars and people like that, and they get this information, and it sort of really grows out of that, but they get this story of this skirmish and Arundel on the beach, and then maybe there's another story of and there's this prophecy, and then he ends up meeting his demise in this skirmish. You never know. But
sounds great, doesn't it?
Mm.
You pull all those things together and you can make a great story out of that. Like the original Spin Doctors, weren't they? Possibly, yeah.
This is where it becomes a real minefield in terms of folklore. Is the investigative part of me is always wanting to know what's the root of it, and you're having to sort of sift through.
Yeah, that's. Yeah, I suppose that's why it's quite hard to. The skeletons in the church, the skeleton in the church, the large skeleton. I like to put what is a likely accurate and less fanciful, but I don't know. There's evidence, but that's interpretive as well. So how do you, or do you just say he was just a big old boy, and the leather drug was because he was a soldier and he fell down and he was drunk and he banged his head? Or do you do what I've done and say that he was a spiritual person? He could have just been 7'6", drunk, fallen down this big hole, being nosy. He's a big, chunky boy, and they've just left him there because they're like, we'll deal with that. That's tomorrow's problem, because I can't move him. He's literally a dead weight. But my spin is, he's a spiritual anchorite. But there's evidence for that. But the leather jug says he's just a big drunk soldier. So what do you do? What do you do with that? Yeah, it's tricky. And was the dark shadow on the causeway, was that just Matt's eyesight playing up? Or was that the first generation of the St Alban? How do we balance that? I think as people we like stories though, don't we? Some of them can be quite far-fetched, but we like a good story and something you can go, yeah!
What do you think is one of the main things that still attracts people here, that is one of the huge draws, that people are still coming here year after year?
It's magical. It's absolutely magical. I mean, you can be anywhere within, sort of a 20-mile radius, 10-mile radius, and you can see it. You can see this fairy tale castle in the sea, and the sea goes in and out. Maybe Disney has contributed in some way because it looks like a fairy castle. And with Disney comes great stories. So a lot of generation today, that's where they get these fairy tale castle ideas from. And then you can stand on the mainland and see an actual fairy tale castle. And then all of those fairy tales, you could be in Penzance telling a story about mermaids from Ariel and Ursula, the sea witch. And then you're walking here, and then you're on a boat here, and then you're actually going to an actual castle. So storytelling might have been overtaken in some ways by popular culture, but they're still magical stories about unreal people, and this is almost an unreal place because it's a castle on a rock, and the moat, if you want to call it that, comes in and comes out, comes in and comes out. It is a strange place. That doesn't happen anywhere else. It doesn't happen in Milton Keynes. It doesn't happen. It's in so few places, and in this country, in the 21st century, to see it, to actually physically see that, is absolutely awe-inspiring for people. It is magic. And then you can go and you can touch it, and you can rub a wishing stone, and you can be told stories about giants. what's not to be appealing? If you described this place to a child and said, we're going to go there on Friday, and they're like, what? Are you? No. Yeah, look at these pictures. And then to do that, to actually go and do it it's special. I think those, you know, from the minute you meet any of the staff, they'll tell you a story. You walk across and there are people that are happy, their residents are happy, the staff are happy. Everyone wants you to enjoy yourself because it's such a great place to be. They feed off your energy and you feed off theirs, and it's the stories that go along with that. If you just take that moment to talk to someone, they'll tell you a story.
So that was my chat with Anna Berska at St Michael's Mount. A big thank you to Anna for taking the time to chat, and to all the team on the Mount for inviting me over. And if you do get a chance to visit, I highly recommend it because it's such an amazing place. That's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it and you found it interesting. As always, if you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at thepiskietrap@gmail.com or drop me a line on social media. You can find the Piskie Trap on Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks' time when I take a trip over to Giva Tin Mine to discover some of the stories there. In the meantime, take care and thanks for listening. The Piskie Trap is presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Caris Harrington.